as you mentioned, very, very important, very timely, because Korea-US relations had been very, very important for the Korean security as well as for the US strategic presence in the region. And comprehending what kind of South Korean policy, South Korean approach has been to the United States is going to be quite important to comprehend the contour of East Asian churning, which is happening for few years. As you know that Korea has been quite, you can say, in a difficult situation when US and China, they compete with each other. Actually, in Korea, there is a very interesting term which is called Kyungjae Chunguk Anbo Miguk, means economy with China and security with the United States. And this kind of separation is only possible when the contest between US and China remains mild. But the more and more it intensifies, the more and more it becomes difficult for South Korea to maintain this balance. And that's why I think different presidents in South Korea, they have taken different routes, especially president from conservative political party. When they come to power, normally they lean towards United States, whereas president from the progressive political party, when they come to power, they generally have more, you can say, connections with China. Not more in the sense that they maintain good relationship with United States, but they want some autonomy to deal with China because China is economically very important for South Korea. Almost 20% of external trade of South Korea is only with China. So in that situation, we are having a president for last 1 year, President Lee. He is considered to be a pragmatic president. He is considered to be a person, a leader who is probably going to avoid two extremes and try to take a pragmatic policy for South Korea. So I think it's a very, very important and very, you can say, interesting uh, time to look at South Korean policy towards United States. And we are having with us, as mentioned, Professor Kang, Dr. Iain Watson, who is acting associate professor at Ajou University of Korea, GSIS, Graduate School of International Study. Dr. Watson had PhD and MA in International Study from Newcastle University, UK. He taught politics at Newcastle University and Durham University, UK, as well as South Korean universities. He has published lots of research articles on Korean foreign policy, Korean foreign aid, multiculturalism, and various other important issues pertaining to Korean studies. He has published a book by Routledge in 2014 on the topic of Korean foreign aid and emerging donors in Asia. He also worked for NGOs in the northeast of England as project support coordinator for refugee-based projects. So I think he is having a very diverse and very interesting experience, and probably he could be the very right person to speak about the present government's, present South Korean administration's policy towards United States. So I'll stop myself here, and now I'll invite Dr. Iain Watson to speak for around 45 minutes, one hour. 45 minutes will be better, and then the floor would be open for questions and discussion. So now I invite Dr. Iain Watson. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very, very kind words. When you mentioned Durham and Newcastle, that seems a long time ago now, but thank you very much. So at the moment, yes, I'm at Ajou University, and again, thank you for Sungho, Professor Kang, for inviting me. I think for the third time, maybe second or third time, I think I've talked to the Global Thursday group. So as in a very kind of introduction, you mentioned, but it's a very timely topic, and you were saying a few words there in your introduction, which I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about today, some of these dilemmas that Korea has, and this word that we hear, well, these two words, I've changed the title slightly, to include these two terms, strategic ambiguity and America first. So one of the paradoxical aspects of Korean politics is that each Korean administration, each presidential administration, has a particular identity in terms of where it sees Korea's role within East Asia, Asia Pacific, and the wider context. And at the moment, a lot of observers are saying that Korea is showing a kind of strategic ambiguity. But I would suggest that that's almost official Korean policy. So there's a kind of strange interaction and a terminology that's used. And also I put America first within this title because there are issues now regarding whether the Trump administration's America first policy necessarily represents US foreign policy. So I think, historically, we can kind of decouple a little bit between administration and the wider context of foreign policy. And I think this decoupling is kind of more pronounced at the moment, given what we're seeing from the Trump administration. So these are kind of issues I want to talk about today. So I need to go to the next screen. So how do I get to the next screen here? Okay. There we go. Yes. Okay. So this is the topic and structure. So I'm going to talk some of the context of these debates. I'm going to talk about the strategic ambiguity question, current Korean responses to the United States. I also want to introduce the nuclear question because this has become a key aspect of the Lee administration's policy towards the US. And I would suggest in the wider context of inter-Korean relations as well. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the nuclear question, then look more specifically at what we mean by America first, Korea and the non-proliferation treaty, because at the moment within Korean politics, and it's always been there, but there seems to be greater support now for Korea essentially going nuclear. And I want to look at some of the implications and the reason why that is happening. I want to talk about some of the trade-offs occurring now. So it's very interesting in your introduction that you talked about this trade-off for Korea between America and China, which has been a big aspect of Korean foreign policy. And I would suggest part of the identity of Korean foreign policy. And I think what we're seeing now with America first and the changes going on within the region is there's again a decoupling and a resetting of these trade-offs. And I think that's opening some opportunities for Korea's foreign policy. And again, a word you mentioned, I think very important, Korea's autonomy and Korea's independence in this context. And then I'll conclude with some of the areas which I think perhaps have been missed in the literature, which I think are actually quite important, maybe quite significant for the future of Korea's role in the region. So this is basically a kind of brief summary of where we are in terms of Korea's relationship, not just with the United States, but with the whole kind of international order within the region, because that, I think, is key to understanding Korea's role now. So what we're getting from the US and what we're getting from a lot of European countries domestically is a kind of challenge to what was traditionally seen as multilateralism, as the international rules-based order, as the international liberal rules-based order. Now, I don't want to go into too much on that today, but this is what we see as a kind of the move towards more populism, more nationalism, and the rejection of these multilateral institutions. And I think Trump, in a way, plays into that. But to do that, this is a kind of historical context. So this all essentially starts post-1945, the Cold War period, everybody familiar with this. And in international relations perspective, we have a school which is called the Realist School of International Relations. And one key writer at the moment who talks a lot about this, I haven't put his name on here, but John Mersheimer, who writes a lot about the kind of the international orders of the Cold War. So essentially we have, during the Cold War period, two international orders, the Soviet Union order and the United States order. And within the United States order, we see differences in different regions. So in Europe, the United States order was essentially NATO, the security order, security alliance was NATO. But in the Asia Pacific, we didn't have that. The Asia Pacific has a slightly different model. Although the United States is trying to pursue a NATO-style collective security in East Asia, many Asian countries, Japan and Korea in particular, were unable to get along with that. They didn't want to cooperate with each other, given the history between Korea and Japan. So the US orders technically are usually seen as what we call a hub and spoke order. So the US is the hub, and the spokes are these kind of bilateral relationships it has with Japan and Korea, are the usual kind of examples that are given under the rubric of US extended deterrence. So it's quite an interesting, quite a unique model. And of course, what this did for the United States essentially was to be able to control allies through bilateral economic reasons, aid, security, the military, and so on. And of course, one of the key fears for the United States all the way during the Cold War, in fact, was not so much fear of the Soviet Union per se, it was more a fear of their allies becoming conflictual, so a potential conflict between Korea and Japan. So that's always the US's main one of the major concerns in the Asia Pacific. So essentially, the hub and spoke model was a way to kind of manage this, to hug allies, to bring allies in. And of course, that gave the United States a lot of power and control over allies through this kind of bilateral relationship where both Korea and Japan went through periods of fears of US abandonment. And we get this paradox within Korea between conservatives and liberals, because we have this kind of, on the one hand, a fear of US abandonment, that the US is going to leave the region. And that's one of the issues that's emerging now, but also a fear of US imperialism, a fear of US intervention. And this has often been a very progressive liberal perspective, but the reason why the Korean peninsula remains divided is because of the United States. Okay, it wants to keep the peninsula divided, and with China, and I suppose in a way with modern day Russia. So there's always a kind of give and take, always kind of contradictory signals coming out domestically. I'll turn to those in a moment. In the post-Cold War era, we have this massive shift. So the international orders of a Cold War disappear, and essentially we are left with one country, the United States, unipolar, powerful, militarily powerful, no real competitors, and realists call this the unbounded rules-based order. So there was an unbounded rules-based order during the Cold War, because that was essentially United Nations. So you had the two bounded orders, but it had a small unbounded international, genuinely global order, I suppose, during the Cold War. But in the post-Cold War era, we have this period of American omnipresence everywhere. So essentially an unbounded order, but based on US power, unipolarity. And this era essentially went through these three main stages. So between 1991 and 2008, we have this what we call the integration era. So this is essentially the era of globalization, the era of integration, the era of convergence. So big literature talking about China's joining the World Trade Organization, China's more active in the UN, the Russians want to get on side with the IMF and join it. I mean, at some point, join the European Union. That was a weird debate about 20, 30 years ago. So the sense of integration, that countries see the benefit of the US order, particularly economic benefits, and they want to join. They want to trade, they want to get involved with globalization. Then we have this next stage, which many analysts call the Cool War period. In Asia, we call this the Asia paradox, where you have rapid economic integration, Southeast Asia, trade, ODA, foreign aid, and so on. So massive economic, the rise of emerging powers, that kind of literature. But you also have emerging geopolitical rivalries, an emergence of nationalism, an emergence of certain policies which suggest that globalization is beginning to fracture a little bit. And this is the era we call the kind of cool war, particularly between US and China. It's not a Cold War, but a sense that the US and China need each other. They rely on each other. They're dependent on each other. But at the same time, they recognize that they're going to have possibly a problem with each other in the future. And again, this is the context of Korea's global Korea, is the context of Korea's Eurasian initiative. At this time, Korea is trying to work out where it stands between US and China. And again, that, as I mentioned in the introduction, that feeds into domestic response between conservatives and progressives. Then we have the next stage, a kind of BRIC stage, where you have the rise of Brazil, Russia, India, China, the rise of emerging powers, a lot of literature on this. And then we hit the stage where I think we're at now, the rivalry stage. So states now are beginning to try to work out where they are positioning with US and China, because this has a big impact for Europe, big impact for the European Union, big impact on NATO as well. And this is what I mentioned before, that a lot of states are waiting because they're not sure whether the United States is fundamentally changing its attitude towards the rest of the world, particularly towards allies rather than traditional enemies, or whether this is a passing phase within US foreign policy. And once the Trump administration leaves office or goes, then it's back to business as usual. So a lot of countries are trying to kind of hedge a little bit at the moment, which again links in a way to I want to talk about in terms of Korea's foreign policy and strategic ambiguity. And then we have the final issue, very briefly, between international orders and international systems. So a big debate in the Asia Pacific now is whether China wants to create its own international order through various trades, foreign aid, and the military issue in the region, maritime areas, or whether China, in fact, is creating an entirely new international system, which goes back to traditional tribute system of imperial China going back centuries. And again, that does play into Korea's foreign policy. But if you have a Korean foreign policy which is based on history, it's based on Joseon dynasty, it's based on that bringing the kind of the old Korean military heroes, Admiral Yi and so on. This is a big issue now in Korean domestic politics. Then technically, historically, Korea is much closer to China. It becomes part of that tribute system. And I think people have underestimated the power of that kind of cultural issue, which is impacts on Korea's foreign policy. And again, a point again raised early introduction, but this idea that Korea is the hermit kingdom, that was seen to be completely different from South Korea, which is promoting itself all the time, soft power, K-soft power, and so on. So it might be interesting if there's a kind of cultural shift going on where Korea, South Korea, becomes a little bit more hermit-like. And that could very much impact on inter-Korean relations between, and of course, the unification question as well. So I'll turn to those issues in a moment. So this is the context, if you like, of strategic ambiguity. So again, as I mentioned, the term and the policy that's quite an interesting relationship, the language and the reality of this. Already mentioned, this is a kind of context. Middle power Korea is a classic approach to Korea's foreign policy, the hedging, whether Korea hedges between US and China, whether it balances China with the US or balances the US with China, whether it tries to remain independent, autonomous, and kind of do that from a more global perspective and multilateral institutions. We have the tariff issue. Korea is very, very sensitive to the tariff issue. The US identified Korea as a problem because of Korea's economic relationship with the United States, the various deficits and so on, but the US perceives Korea as taking advantage of the United States. And there's this very paradoxical mindset within the US that the US is portraying great power, the MAGA, the Trump, they're kind of promoting US power, but also at the same time a sense of victimhood as well, that the US has been used by allies. It's not a level playing field. There's a kind of strange narrative coming out. And of course, the US itself at the moment is looking at allies not as historic partners, but as a problem. As countries that are using the United States have benefited from the US, and it's time for a bit of payback. It's time for the other countries to pay back compensation, to open up their economies to US trade, to give a bit of money back. This is very much the Trump policy. And then we have the final issue in terms of the narrow context, in terms of cybersecurity. That's a big issue for the current Lee administration, the visible and invisible enemy question, and of course the issue of AI. So I don't want to talk too much about AI because that's a much wider issue and it's a big part of the Lee administration. But I do want to briefly mention some issues that have raised this, because early on, 20 or 30 years ago, when AI was very much in its infancy, a lot of the kind of the experts and engineers and so on saw AI so far in the future, but they didn't really want to get too much involved. There wasn't too much investment in AI, and clearly that's very much changed now. So I'm not sure the kind of the complete facts on this, but there's been various discussions that those early engineers were often migrant labor within countries which now have AI with foreign passports. And of course, they now are in control of AI. Okay, so you have this very strange security question now where the engineers and the experts in AI are essentially foreign citizens. And that brings in a lot of issues about the question of who owns this technology, who has access to this technology, the invisible enemies within. It's a very kind of almost like Cold War-ish kind of issue going on. And of course, the question is whether that was engineered by countries like Russia and China, or whether maybe it's just happened coincidentally. The second issue is North Korea. So North Korea was a constitutional change in North Korea a couple of years ago, where the North Korean government took out the word reunification from the constitution. So North Korea has no interest whatsoever in reunification. It sees the Korean peninsula as divided, as two separate Korean states. And of course, this is part of North Korea's narrative that North Korea wants to have its sovereignty recognized by the United States. It wants an end to the Cold War. It wants a proper peace treaty, and that will give North Korea legitimation with the international community, has no need for South Korea, okay? And this is also maybe a generational issue as well. Although President Lee has talked about what he calls a Korea premium. So what the Lee administration is talking about is maybe some kind of post-armistice peace deal or peace regime where the two Koreas can work together, but essentially as two sovereign states within the international community. So that's very early stage in that, but quite an interesting development. And then we have the wider context of multilateral reform, what's called friend-shoring in Korea, looking for friends, looking for peers. And of course, one of these paradoxes in Korean foreign policy, but looking for friends and peers, but also very sensitive to what other nations think about Korea. Okay, it's a massive part of Korean foreign policy. Okay, so these are some of the kind of current responses domestically to the United States. And as I mentioned, there is a distinction perhaps we can generate between the Trump administration and US foreign policy. Okay, maybe it's a harsh distinction, but I think for what we're seeing at the moment, it's a plausible one. In terms of concerns of abandonment of the US, which has been a constant theme for conservatives and liberals, that the US wants to give up the Mutual Defense Treaty or wants to take its troops out of South Korea. Conservatives have generally been very concerned about that. They want to keep US troops in South Korea. They want to keep the army bases open. They want United States support. So kind of classic, very conservative. And this is what we saw right through from 1945, all the different conservative administrations. But liberals are kind of a little bit more sort of open to that. They understand the importance of the alliance, a bit of nostalgia as well for that as well. But the liberals, many liberals would be quite happy to see the US downgrade a little bit and move out of Korea. They see the US as provoking North Korea, provoking China. But again, we can't generalize too much because even within conservative and liberal parties or progressive movements, there were a lot of big differences. And of course, one of the paradoxes has been that often when you get a kind of more skeptical administration, Moon Jae-in was a kind of example of this a few years ago, very skeptical towards the US, very kind of pro-North Korea, pro-unification and so on. But he actually ended up being a very pro-US administration. We often find this, the liberal progressives often end up being much closer to the US, either intentionally or unintentionally. And the second issue here about whether the United States is now having a greater impact on the Asia Pacific. It wants to be more invested in the Korean Peninsula, but in a different way. So I think this is what the Trump administration is saying, is 2025 national security document. We want to be involved, but in a slightly different way. So this is concerning to the conservatives that maybe the US is talking about getting rid of or moving away from the military troops on the Korean Peninsula, handing over military command to the Korean army and the Korean military command. That's a big issue at the moment. And some of the liberals are quite happy with this. Okay, it's our autonomy, it's our sovereignty. We're too dependent on the US. Korea is strong enough now to do this on its own. And the conservatives are saying that's very naive because we live in a kind of a new age now. We need the United States. One issue I'll talk about a little bit later is that the Trump administration is shifting its position on the Korean Peninsula. So it's basically regarding the Korean Peninsula now as a kind of stopping off point to defend Taiwan. So US is very concerned about Taiwan, about China. And again, a lot of conservatives are saying the United States is downgrading the Korean Peninsula. So the troops are only here because they're there to defend Taiwan, not South Korea. Trump, I think, still want to deal with North Korea, so that would solve that problem for the North Koreans and the United States. And there's a sense of kind of a little bit of US abandonment, whereas a lot of liberal progressives are saying, well, look, we don't want to be involved in any US-China-Taiwan conflict. We want to stay out of that. So if the US is moving troops away or looking at the Korean Peninsula in a different way, maybe downgrading, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, we'll have that, because what we don't want is to be sucked into any conflict between US and China right on our doorsteps. That would not be good for Korea's economy or Korea's reputation. It's built in many, many different parts and different regions of the world. So that's a kind of the context or current responses. Now, I did mention I want to talk a little bit about here the nuclear question, because this has become an issue of the Lee administration in the last few months. The United States has always been very against any of its allies having access or looking at potentially nuclear weapons programs. That again is changing a little bit now. The Trump administration has been very open to Korea building nuclear powered submarines, to importing enriched uranium to power these submarines. And of course, Korea generally, as I mentioned a little bit later, has been very active in the arms exports of NATO, with the Ukraine situation and so on. So a very different ballgame in Korea. And again, this is the context for this whole debate is now occurring. So there's always been debates in Korea about whether Korea should go nuclear, either through US extended deterrence or whether unilateral indigenous nuclear program. In the Cold War, this was seen to be very bad because it would disrupt the balance of power, the mutually assured destruction, which basically kept the world at peace during the Cold War. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1969, Korea signed that in 1975. North Korea was also a party to the NPT, but left in 2003. So again, I'll mention this a little bit later with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty question, which is now becoming seen as a legitimate debate in Korea. So it's quite horrifying for some, but it's seen as a way that Korea has some kind of negotiation leverage, but it has the possibility of going nuclear. That would change or generate more security for Korea, but could very much prompt Japan to move in that kind of direction as well. In the post-Cold War era, these are various words that are often used when it comes to the nuclear issue: weapons of mass destruction, rogue states, kind of classic Bush administration. And these are the words we often see. So the red lines, that a country must not go beyond red lines in terms of nuclear technology. This has been a big issue, of course, with Iran, with the Obama-Iran deal a few years ago. The term breakout technology, but once you go down this path, you'll get to a certain stage where you have this breakout technology, and there's no putting the lid back on again. It's out there, it's done. You generate momentum, and a word that we hear a lot now in Korea, nuclear latency. In other words, Korea doesn't want to go down this path, but it could very quickly if it wanted to. And that itself has a lot of power, okay? That sense of we could, but not just yet. So it gets that sense of uncertainty. And this is why strategic ambiguity becomes such an important issue, because that sense of uncertainty, that sense of ambiguity, Korea a few years ago would have been very concerned about these words: uncertainty, ambiguity. That's not what middle power Korea is all about. Now, this present administration seems to be embracing these words: latency, uncertainty, ambiguity. That's a positive. Okay, that's being used in Korea's diplomacy. It's in that position now. And then we have that wider context of a technology involved, that the same civilian technology can also be militarized. And there's very much a blurring of lines now between what is civilian technology and military technology. And of course, that's not just a nuclear issue, that's also a cyber security issue as well. So these are some of the current domestic responses to the nuclear question, which I think are going to be really important in the next few years, the conservatives and progressives. So you can, in a way, place this in a wider context of peace theory. In other words, the conservatives or a lot of realists say that nuclear weapons are good because they create peace. Then, of course, the question becomes peace for who? Who benefits from this? So, of course, the progressives have often seen nuclear technology as benefiting the military-industrial complex, benefiting the corporations, the companies, the big state, and so on. I put in the atoms for peace. That was, I think, President Eisenhower's speech before he left office. The idea that nuclear technology can be used for peaceful means, but also can be used for military means as well. And we're still stuck with that in a way. But in a way, it has also changed because of the blurring of lines, essentially, between the two. The debates on nuclear sovereignty, well, the current administration talks about this END acronym. So exchange, normalization, and denuclearization. These are policies essentially towards North Korea. Okay, so this is it's as a progressive administration, there are still sunshine era politicians who still see cooperation with North Korea as possible, exchange, normalization of relations, denuclearization. But as I said earlier, I think there's this context of North Korea saying it's not interested in reunification is a big shift. And I think that's something that a lot of us individuals in the new administration would took really, really seriously. President Lee made a speech a few months ago. He made a distinction between denuclearization, which is official Korean American policy, and a peninsula without nuclear weapons. Okay, so denuclearization has been usually coupled up with the armistice, with peace, with unification, with reunification. These words have been kept together, okay, in over 20 or 30-year period. What I'm suggesting here is these words are now becoming decoupled, much more ambiguous. So there's a slight distinction here between the official denuclearization as official policy, but a Korean peninsula without nuclear weapons. That's more ambiguous. That's more open to interpretation. It's not official policy. So it gives Korea a little bit of room here if it's thinking about going down this particular path. And then we have these various approaches to countries that do have nuclear weapons. I'll come to the Iraq situation very briefly in a moment. To stop countries having nuclear weapons, to reduce nuclear weapons, to dismantle, and of course the verification issue, which of course is the big one. For many countries. So I think the nuclear question, and again, I'll come back to that a little bit later, is certainly a major one at the moment for the current administration. This essentially is America first. Okay, so as I mentioned, we can perhaps distinguish between the America first of Trump and the wider structural context of US foreign policy. And that's not new, that's always been the case. But what I think is happening now is an incredible mismatch occurring between the policy and the language of the United States and the international reality. That's a mismatch, which could have very dire consequences for Korea, because one of the issues in Korean foreign policy has always been to promote Korea as a middle power, as a more autonomous power, as a powerful state. A lot of policymakers can get carried away with that. A lot of observers can get carried away as well. They start to talk about Korea as a regional power, as a nuclear power. Korea can do anything, K-soft power, it's the economy, trade. And that can feed in itself, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, when in fact the reality is that Korea is in a very, very vulnerable situation with the China and US relationship, and could be using up a lot of resources, sending a lot of military equipment to NATO, to Europe. And one issue occurring in Korea now is, why is Korea sending all this stuff to Europe? It should be here, just in case the uncertainties in the region. But of course, by sending military exports to European countries, Poland, US, Norway, for instance, that's great for the Korean economy. And that's also great for Korea's soft power as well. Korea is involved, but indirectly in Ukraine with Europe and so on. And that's been a big aspect of President Lee's policy, to open up more channels with Europe, with the European Union. And I'm making a distinction here between Europe and the European Union because the two relatively key middle powers, which also form a part of Korea's strategy in Europe, are Britain and Turkey. So these are countries both in NATO, but both outside the European Union, essentially middle power countries. And that has a big impact actually on British-Turkey relationship at the moment as well, because there's a lot of talk in Europe about having some kind of European security alliance, which would exclude Turkey and Britain. And of course, a lot of European Union countries saying we can't rely on the US anymore. The US is clearly not interested in NATO. We've got to do this on our own. Okay, so again, the same debates in Europe were also seen in the Asia Pacific about the relationship with the United States. So essentially, a lot of commentators say this is a classic realism, that the United States is showing its power, it's showing its nationalism. It's also mercantilist. In other words, it's against globalization, it's protectionist, it's tariffs, it's not trusting allies, it's asking for compensation from allies. So a kind of very mercantilist, very protectionist policy, very realist in terms of military power. So this is where a lot of literature talks about as a kind of classic realist, mercantilist policy. I would like to suggest that on the one hand, that is true, but I think we've got to look at the domestic situation in the US. And the paradoxical, signals from the Trump administration, where Trump is very anti-multilateralism, very protectionist, very much focused on the Western Hemisphere. So this is kind of the Venezuela issue a few months ago, anti-multilateralism, anti-globalist, back to the classic spheres of influence, the international orders, but this time defined by the Western Hemisphere rather than the traditional US international order of the Western Asia Pacific and Western Europe. So this has been the big shift within America First. That America First is very much based on Canada, North America, South America, and is showing less interest in Europe and less interest in allies such as Japan and Korea. I would argue that if you use the traditional concepts, that is correct. But if you look at this in a different way and see this through the lens of the Trump administration and domestic politics in the United States, it's another form of US global hegemony, but occurring in a very, very different format. And this is where the uncertainty is about whether what we're seeing now in terms of the exertion of US power is traditional Cold War, post-Cold War US hegemonic power, or whether it's US power, but based on a very unique kind of Trump nationalism, because these are very contradictory policies coming out of the US. US extended deterrence is a kind of global policy, but at the same time, the administration is also very critical of allies. It threatened to invade Denmark. It threatens to pull out of NATO. It's rhetoric, but rhetoric can very quickly become reality. So this is the kind of the contradictions occurring within America first. And of course, a lot of writers say that essentially this is all about Trump and the administration talking to a domestic audience. The whole thing is domestic, not international. And that's why many allies now are thinking, let's just wait. Let's wait until next year. Let's wait a couple of years and see where the US is going. And that would make sense. But of course, China is also waiting as well. So we have everyone's kind of waiting to see what everybody else does. And of course, that can have a lot of unintended consequences, given what's happening domestically in many countries within Europe, the shift to the right, the shift to the far right in some countries. And if these parties get into power, that is very much going to change this entire agenda more globally. So Trump's policy is essentially Western Hemisphere. That's not new. So very early on, Trump talked about the Monroe Doctrine, which is a kind of the traditional starting off point of US foreign policy. All other countries, especially the colonial powers, keep out of the Western Hemisphere. This is America's backyard. This is America's neighborhood. That's the whole Venezuela thing was all about that. This is basically ours. This is our backyard. And therefore, we don't need to worry about Europe, the Asia Pacific. That's their problem. Okay, they have to deal with it themselves, nothing to do with us. And yet we also get this paradoxical exertion of US power telling other countries what to do in Europe, in the Asia Pacific, with allies in Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, a lot of uncertain, a lot of contradictory signals. So that, in a sense, is where Korea is. So this idea of middle power, of hedging, one argument now is hedging what exactly? Who exactly is Korea going to balance with? Who is Korea going to hedge with? It was easy 5 or 10 years ago, US and China, that was obvious. But now we have a situation where it's not China or Russia challenging the US international order, it's the US challenging the US international order. That's a very different context and a very different ballgame. And of course, paradoxically, what we are beginning to see now is that China, especially, is saying, and many countries in the global south are saying, well, look, if America and Europe are going to break away from all these multilateral organizations, we'll take them. We'll take their seats. So there's a strange situation where it's China and many anti-Western countries in the global south now take over and are more in control of these institutions that the US and the West set up 40 or 50 years ago. So that's an inversion which I think Korea very much needs to keep an eye on. This is why the ambiguous thing is really important. I'll very briefly talk about this. This is a kind of domestic issue now in Korea. A lot of the literature is saying, because of this uncertainty, Korea needs a nuclear weapons program, or the US needs to create an extended deterrence, which is now nuclear-based. So the nuclear weapons were taken out of Korea in 1992, 1993, that transition period between the Bush and the Clinton administrations, and haven't been there since. But a lot of talk now between conservatives and progressives, and indeed it's an area where many conservatives and progressives actually agree with each other. But the conservatives say we need nuclear weapons because we need to protect ourselves against North Korea. If America is going to abandon us, we need that protection. And the liberals are saying, well, okay, we understand that, but North Korea will not be a problem if the US leave anyway. We can have a much better relationship with North Korea if the Americans leave. But for us, this is about status. This is about autonomy. This is about nuclear sovereignty. Okay, we're not dependent on anybody. And that liberal progressive terminology and language also often shows echoes of the hermit kingdom. Okay, this idea of autonomy, leave us alone. Okay, we've got the nuclear weapons now. We're not dependent on other countries for our security. You can now all leave us alone. Okay, now we can get on with unification or North Korea in our own way. Again, that's generalizing a bit, but it's interesting how for different reasons, there is a consensus out there between progressives and conservatives beginning to emerge. And again, just on this, a lot of during the Sunshine period, a lot of writers are talking about this idea. Well, we don't need a nuclear weapon if we have a better relationship with North Korea. And North Korea actually learned in 2003, as I mentioned, when North Korea left the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003, that essentially was brought about by US foreign policy in 2003, the invasion of Iraq. That's not a coincidence, because North Korea abided by the NPT for many, many years. And essentially, there were three countries at this time where a lot of writers say North Korea learned a lot. That's why we have a nuclearized North Korea now. So the three countries really stand out: Libya, Iran, and Iraq. So in the case of Libya under Colonel Gaddafi, Libya gave up nuclear weapons and was invaded, and Gaddafi lost power and was killed in 2011. So North Korea learned, do not give up nuclear weapons. The moment you do that, the regime will collapse. It learned from Iran that if we have a nuclear weapons program, the West is going to be concerned. The Americans are going to want to do a deal. The West is going to want to do a deal. This is the Obama argument. In a way, it's a Trump argument as well. And part of that is North Korea's deal essentially will be, we want recognition as North Korea, as a sovereign state. We want to open diplomatic ties with Washington. That's what the 2018, 2019 Trump-Kim summits were all about. North Korean flag, US flag. That's what Kim essentially wants, legitimation. And of course, that's good for Kim's domestic politics as well, to give that international recognition. And the final one, don't bluff. This is the Saddam Hussein argument. If you've got weapons of mass destruction, you have to tell the world you've got them. Otherwise, there might be uncertainty. Okay, so this is the tragedy of 2003. Essentially, Saddam Hussein was saying, not saying directly, but hinting he had weapons of mass destruction because of Iran. Okay, next door neighbors, he had to do that. And of course, that was completely misread in 2003. So the warning for North Korea was, if you've got a nuclear weapons program, you make sure the world knows about it. That's why the nuclear weapons tests rapidly increase during the 2000s. Okay, very clear this country has nuclear weapons, or the possibility of nuclear weapons. And this final point here about Korea leaving the NPT, a lot of academics have said that this is good for Korea, that it allows Korea to have its own nuclear weapons, and other countries would understand because of the situation in Northeast Asia. I myself have been very, very critical of that and very skeptical of that. It's very short-termist and doesn't look at the intended and perhaps unintended consequences. And a big part of it, of course, is Korea's own reputation as party to the NPT and as Korean soft power. So by leaving the NPT, essentially Korea would become a rogue state with North Korea. And a big part of Korea's power has been, we are part of the international community. We abide by the rules. We're a rule maker as well, rule taker and a rule maker. This has been a part of all Korea's administrations, conservative and progressive. So this is what I talked about a little bit earlier, the new trade-offs with the US. So geopolitically, in 2025, and Pete Hegseth introduced his national security strategy, the Korean Peninsula is now defined as a region. Okay, so kind of a sub-region of Northeast Asia. And for many observers, the US has seen the Korean Peninsula as a stopping off point to defend Taiwan. And of course, this could be an issue very much for the way that American troops and the Americans see South Korea and see the Korean Peninsula as a problem, mainly to defend from China, Taiwan from China, maybe as part of America's island strategy, but not necessarily directly to defend South Korea. Okay, so this is a big issue now for a lot of Koreans in this new administration. To keep Korea separate, that's one of the arguments, as I mentioned, putting through, but the concern there is that Korea would become more isolated. To keep Korea separated from the US and China and Taiwan issues means a situation of what's called Korea past. So there's a lot of concern about Korea's isolation. And again, this is back to the hermit kingdom mindset. On the one hand, there are those policymakers who say isolation is not necessarily a bad thing, because that's part of our history. It's part of Korea's history, not necessarily South Korea's history, because South Korea is all about getting out there, global Korea, selling K-pop, selling soft power, selling K-food. Everything you can put a K next to is all about Korea's foreign policy. And of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, historically, it's not a K, it's a C. Okay, so this is very uniquely South Korea, not necessarily Korea. And again, that feeds into the identity question. I think this is very much an issue happening now to decouple the Mutual Defense Treaty, which still holds and is still very strong, to decouple that from the actual US-Korea alliance. Previously, it had been assumed that they were the same thing. That US-Korea relations were defined by the Mutual Defense Treaty, and that defines extended deterrence, and that defines the US-Korea alliance. I think what the current administration is doing to give it more options is to see these a little bit more flexibly. This is the ambiguity. So you can have a strong US alliance, 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty, but you can also begin to pull away a little bit from the United States, but in a different way that allows you to have very strong relationships with China. And the way to do that is to deliberately create a sense of ambiguity where countries are coming to Korea to ask Korea, what are you doing? And that's the big shift. Before, everyone knew Korea was a kind of middle power. It was bridging, it was hedging, but to deliberately create uncertainty and ambiguity. At the moment, a year into the administration, that, in my view, is what the President Lee administration is doing. It's doing a lot of international diplomacy to try and a lot of options to try and work out how we can frame and define our ambiguity. And this is very different from the previous Yoon administration, which had been very, very clear. We are with the US all the way. This is the Indo-Pacific. This is what we stand for, like-minded countries, democratic values. And outside the Indo-Pacific are the Eurasian axis of, well, to use the Bush administration term, axis of evil, Eurasian autocratic states, Iran, China, Russia, North Korea. They are all connected by the Eurasian landmass. And Indo-Pacific is all about maritime democracy, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and so on in the region. That was very much for Yoon administration's essentially division. And of course, the dividing line was the DMZ, North Korea, South Korea. That was a dividing line between Eurasia and Indo-Pacific. And this is all seen in the Yoon administration's relationship with the Biden administration. Yoon went to the White House and sang songs and so on. Very, very close relationship. In my view, that's all gone now. That absolutely vanished. And what Korea is doing now is much more this kind of, we're going to ambiguous, a bit more deliberate uncertainty. We kind of work this out. But the paradox for Korean foreign policy has always been that each president only has a 5-year term. So by the end of next year, President Lee will begin to be thinking about his legacy already. It happens very, very quickly. So always there's often a mismatch between great policies, and these policies will work in 2 or 3 years' time, but in 2 or 3 years' time, you'll no longer be president. And the next president will reverse everything, both for political reasons, but often for personal reasons as well. So this has always been one of the big issues in Korean foreign policy, the sense of every 5 years. And it wouldn't matter so much if the bureaucracy and the foreign, departments, the foreign policy departments, the bureaucracies are there forever. There's a continuity there. But the problem in Korean politics is often the people in the bureaucracies then get handpicked by the next president for various reasons. And that can disrupt and disturb a lot of the kind of continuity in Korean foreign policy. So again, that becomes a domestic issue. And this is as I've read more about this over quite a long period over the years and so on. And although my area is very much international relations, I think a lot of international relations people underestimate the serious impact that domestic politics and often personal politics can play in this. So a lot of realists and so on talk about the big structures of international relations, and there are patterns to international relations, but domestic politics plays a big part in this as well. This is where we are at the moment with the nuclear issue. So the Americans agreed about January, February this year that the Koreans will be allowed, and again, that word allowed still suggests US power and US interests in the region, to import enriched uranium, to build nuclear-powered submarines. The Lee administration was very clear that it would not go beyond that. It would not go beyond any red lines. It was very clear that it's remained within the non-proliferation treaty. But the problem with this is that makes sense. That is legally correct. But Korea has never done this before. So the very fact that it's even thinking about this would impact on regional relations with Japan and North Korea. So there's always that kind of tension between legally Korea is 100% with the NPT. It doesn't go against the NPT. It's absolutely correct. But the perception But this is the first time Korea has done that. This is a new ball game. This is new territory, and that can feed into a lot of unintentional consequences. And the Lee administration is very much aware of that. The other issue, well, I want to, yeah, a couple more points I want to make before I conclude here. So, yes, it's kind of the final issue here is the reputation of Korea's role and reputation. So, Korea at the moment is very much a big arms exporter. So, for someone who's been looking at Korean politics for about 20 years or so, this has come as a real shock. Okay, historically, South Korea does not export tanks and guns to war zones. Korea does ODA. Korea does development. Korea does trade. It does K-food. It doesn't do howitzer tanks and the latest in weaponry. And this is part of the previous Yoon administration's move to put Korea at a very high level of arms exporter. Primarily, okay, there's a security issue here, but I would argue primarily for economic reasons, okay? And the Americans, again, see this as quite positive. They say, great, Korea is living up to its expectations and is providing aid, military aid, to Europe. That's what European countries should be doing. Tick box, Korea's done really well. But on the other hand, the Americans are also saying, if Korea is exporting all its weapons to Europe, then that means that we have to plug the holes in the Asia Pacific. So that's not good. Okay, so this is one of the tensions that the Lee administration has been going through over the last few months to say to the Americans, we will pull our weight. It's good for Korea's reputation, but we're also leaving gaps, which the Americans are saying we shouldn't be filling. You should be looking after yourselves back in your region. This is your region. You shouldn't really be engaging with Europe. That's Europe's problem, not your problem. But of course, it's a big opportunity for the Korea's trade and Korea's economy. The Indo-Pacific was a word that was used a few years ago, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Yoon administration. That's still important. But New Zealand and Japan are also, in a way, potentially exploiting the possibility of Korea's reputation being taken a hit here, because New Zealand and Japan, for their various histories and position in the Asia Pacific, are very anti-nuclear. New Zealand has always been very anti-nuclear tests in the South Pacific. Japan has a lot of aid partners in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia and so on. Japan and New Zealand, geologically very similar. They are islands in the region. So they have a very strong regional reputation. And within Korea, there's a concern that New Zealand and Japan especially would exploit this kind of Korean shift, that Korea is more invested in Europe and not in its own region. And that would be difficult for Korea because Korea's reputation to be able to go into Europe has been based on its regional reputation as a non-colonial state, as a state that's experienced colonization, as very vulnerable, very threatened, not really traditionally seen as a great power in the region. That kind of imagery of Korea has been absolutely key to Korea's reputation, global reputation. And if Korea starts to go nuclear or starts to export more, that reputation will go. And that's been a big part of Korea's foreign policy. And the final point I'd like to raise here today is that always that tension between the nuclear issue and the environment. Okay, so because one of the arguments for liberal progressives has always been that nuclear technology would be a good security in terms of climate change. Okay, so it would cut all the fossil fuels, all the rest of it. But of course, the worry is that, and Korea has been active in the nuclear technology for many, many years. It exported nuclear technology to the United Arab Emirates, and so it was very, very active in this. And that makes a lot of sense. It was part of Lee Myung-bak's green growth policy. Green growth was exported to many parts in the global south. That all makes sense. The difficulty now is those very same policies in a new context of America first, or in a new context of Korea potentially coming away from the NPT or making nuclear submarines, it all becomes more muddled, and it's very much new territory. What are Korea's intentions here? And I would argue that because the Lee administration is aware of this slogan, strategic ambiguity, it's saying, we're not hiding this. We're actually promoting this as our policy. It is ambiguous. It is very, very uncertain. And that's the point. The paradox being, of course, in a Korean context, once an administration does that, strategic ambiguity becomes very fixed and it loses that fluidity. It loses that uncertainty and becomes a defining label, which I argue is actually very counterproductive to what strategic ambiguity is all about. So the Lee administration has been there for just over a year. And it's still waiting. I think a lot of is waiting for the midterm elections in America in 2026 to see if the Trump administration is hit badly by these midterms, and maybe there's a shift in the wider context of US foreign policy. But in my view, this is what the ambiguity question is all about. Korea is now positioning at a global level, still very reactive. It was a member of the United Nations Security Council last year, on non-permanent members, so very active internationally. It still represents the classic middle power, strategic middle power, bridge power, and so on. But there seems to have been a much more open and fluid approach to Korea's role here. Whether you can call that a middle power position or whether it represents Korea being very strong and autonomous and very powerful, but Korea actually reverting back to a secondary power with the United States, I think still remains to be seen. So these are some of the issues, I think, the arms issue, the regional question, and the nuclear question, which I think will possibly define the next year of the Lee administration. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. I think you had a very comprehensive survey of South Korean foreign policy and almost all possible angles, all possible issues which are basically there in between South Korean approach towards United States. So I think we learned a lot. Now the floor is open for comments and questions.
First of all, Iain, Professor Watson, would you close this, your
yes,
the
yes,
PPT? Okay. Okay, very good.
So floor is open. Yeah, Professor Mikiosi.
Yeah, okay.
Please be brief.
Brief.
Okay, as you please.
Okay. Anyway, so the Professor Watson, thank you very much for your very comprehensive and very well balanced view in the East Asia, especially Northeast Asia. I think it's quite interesting what you seeing now, right now. Yeah? Maybe I will ask you two questions. One is the relationship and the relationship. How do I say? South Korea's policy towards Taiwan. How the Taiwan issue can be the security issue to South Korea. Maybe maybe you also already know Japan, right? Under the current Takaichi administration, Taiwan, and the emergency situation may pose the existential threat to Japan, right? And I don't subscribe this idea, but also South Korea. For a long time, South Korea was, how do you say, overwhelmingly concerned with the North Korea relationship, right? Then I'm just curious how the South Korea considered the Taiwan Strait issue as a kind of security issue, and maybe you can share this one, right? Your idea. This is the first question. Second question is the South Korea's position to the, how they say, maybe the rising voice, increasing voice of the global South countries. I live in Malaysia, and most of my time I live in global South, so that I know what's happening in global South. And then the global South may be the anti-neocolonialism, right? And something like that, anti-neocolonialism. Typically in Africa, former French colonies like Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, and they are kind of spearheading the anti-colonialism, and also these and also global South countries. How do I say? Maybe I think the more sympathetic to Russia and China. And I feel, because they feel the anti-neocolonialism, right? And of course, this one is also by the Western countries, right? So I'm just also wondering to what degree South Korea kind of align itself with this maybe general trend in global South. So these two questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the questions in order. So on the Taiwan question, what was interesting during the Biden administration and the Yoon administration was that Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and the US came up with the Chip 4 initiative, which essentially was all about the semiconductor construction in Taiwan and then Korea marketing it, and very, very, very close together. I think it was formally put together, not formally, but very much part of the Washington Declaration of 2023. So these four countries working strongly together in terms of technology, in terms of economics. Korea therefore saw Taiwan essentially as an economic issue, as a trade issue for the chaebols, for Samsung and Hyundai and so on. And of course, in a way that impacted on Korea's investment in China, because China was very skeptical. And of course, I think under the Yoon administration, China basically told a lot of Korean companies to move out, and they relocated in the United States, and Vietnam got a lot of Korean investment at this time as well. So from a Korean mindset, Taiwan has always been seen as an economic issue or as a China-Taiwan issue, something that Korea can kind of keep away from. It's not really Korea's business or issue, because North Korea has always been a major one. So paradoxically, over the last 20 or 30 years, with South Korea so focused on North Korea, there was almost a justification that South Korea didn't have to get involved in Taiwan question, and also other countries would understand that, because it's so focused on North Korea. It doesn't. We understand if you're not going to get involved in that. The paradox now is that with North Korea where it is, and now much more focused on Russia and China and Ukraine and so on, and with the American administration, Korea can no longer avoid Taiwan or justify its avoidance of Taiwan. And this is why the American administration, it came as quite a shock to Korean policymakers, the American administration put much more focus on Taiwan and not North Korea, and that unnerved a lot of Korean policymakers. And this has always been one of the tensions in Korean policy, that on the one hand, we want to solve the North Korean question because it's a threat and we're worried about it. But actually, it's quite useful for us to have North Korea, because it doesn't mean we have to get involved with Taiwan. It also gives us a lot of attention, a lot of visibility as well. The worst thing that can happen is that we get ignored. That's again a part of the Korean policy mindset. So at the moment, I would say that the Lee administration, again, is saying on the Taiwan question, we will support the United States. We will support Japan, because there's a strangely now emerging a very, I wouldn't say close relationship, but much more open relationship between Japan and Korea under this new administration. Now, whether that's valid or whether that's sustainable, I'm not sure. But again, this is a big shift in Korea, because traditionally progressives have been very anti-Japan and very skeptical of Japan. And I think this is part of US allies, this uncertainty. The difficulty for Korea is that because Taiwan is a relatively new issue, that experience of the Taiwan-China question is something very, very new. So what I think Korean policymakers do is they're trying to frame this in terms of the Korean Peninsula, and to say our main concern is that the US focus on Taiwan and not us. Therefore, we have to bring the US back to us. So they're looking at the Taiwan issue as a way to pivot and to bring South Korea back into the US area, or the US kind of interest, or kind of the visibility. Because really, in my view, Korea doesn't have that much to offer Taiwan in terms of security issues. Yes, in terms of economics, but really it doesn't have that experience with Taiwan that Japan and China clearly, and the United States has. So I think what the Lee administration is trying to do is to use this as kind of strategic ambiguity, to use another issue to be able to bring the US into our issue as well. So they've got to be because what Korea is concerned about, and always has been, is we don't want to be sucked into any China-Taiwan Strait conflict. We don't want to be sucked into that. If the US calls us for help, we don't want anything to do with that. But on the other hand, we have to stay relevant. Okay, so it's a very, very fine line. I think the way Taiwan has been used is to bring Korea and Japan closer together. I think that's what's happening there, but it opens an opportunity for Korea and Japan to have a better relationship. And in my view, that's absolutely key to balance China. So all the way through, my view has been Korea and Japan have to get really, really close. But that's difficult because of the politics and domestic politics between them, and even more difficult if Korea goes nuclear. That relationship would be very, very difficult. So I think Taiwan has been used, so not directly but indirectly, as a signal to the US, and not to use that relevance, but economically very, very relevant. On your second point, the global South issue, that has basically been Korea's oxygen in multilateral organizations with the ODA partners, with the recipient countries, Africa, Latin America. It's been representing the global South. It's always made this argument early on that Korea was also colonized. Japan could never make that argument because of the history and so on. So it's always been a friend of the global South, part of that. The problem has been, what's called the middle power paradox, that the more Korea becomes more stronger economically and has more visibility globally, the global South begins to see Korea as a problem. Okay, it's no longer talking to them. It wants to be involved with NATO. It wants to be involved with the EU, which is full of colonial countries. It's inviting European countries to the Indo-Pacific to talk about the nuclear question, talk about Ukraine, talk about NATO. And a lot of global South questions are very now, they like that on the one hand because they felt that Korea was their voice. But I think that's all changed now. And it's interesting that a lot of Korean policymakers now are often getting very negative responses from ASEAN or from Vietnam and countries that are now in Indonesia and the Philippines, which are now becoming much more powerful and stronger. And it's saying to Korea, you don't represent us anymore. And firstly, we can do this on our own. We don't need you anymore anyway. We can do this on our own. You don't represent us. And the problem with Korea is that you keep dragging post-colonial powers into the region. You kept dragging us into North Korea issues. You keep talking about the European Union. We don't want to talk about any of that. And the interesting thing is that under American foreign policy, America doesn't either. Okay, America's focused on its own hemisphere. So it's quite interesting change in dynamic. And you're absolutely on that point you made there about the BRICS, about Russia and China, but traditionally this has been that kind of the global South has gravitated towards China. That's always been China's big thing. In 1974, Deng Xiaoping made a speech to the UN saying, and even today, Xi Jinping has been known to say that China is still a third world country. Okay, so it's kind of the Chinese double speak and so on. Everyone knows what Xi Jinping is saying, but it's that sense of we have solidarity still with Africa. We understand Africa, we understand Latin America, and so on. But one of the interesting dynamics now is, and maybe this is why one of the reasons why China is monitoring this, but if the US and Europe decides to pull out of all these organizations because of the domestic politics, then there's going to be a lot of gaps and vacuums in the United Nations, in these multilateral organizations, which could be filled by China and filled by the global South. And I think this is already happening in the United Nations. In the United Nations General Assembly, there are many more countries in the global South than in the global North. So the UN General Assembly has a lot of power. And one of the arguments coming through now is if Britain or France or European Union or United States are basically saying, look, we don't want anything to do with this anymore. It's globalist and it's been taken advantage of by the global South, and we don't want to put our resources into this because we have our own problems and difficulties and so on. Then it's possible especially United Nations might say, okay, we'll become a global South organization. But we don't need China to create its own organizations. We'll just take over. And I think in the UN context, that's even down to basic numbers, that could happen. The problem is that concept of the global South is very general. And I think we're seeing now in different regions, countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, again, depending on the administration in charge, they're beginning to say, well, actually, we are not global South. We are now competing on a level playing fields with global North. We don't want to become global North because that's not our history, that's not our region. But we can compete very easily with G7, G8. If you look at our economies now, we're in 10 years will be way past all this. So that concept of global South becomes much more complicated, I think, if we see the West abandoning these organizations. But one final point here is that Korea, the current administration, even the UN administration, was very clear that countries that Korea used to provide aid to are now asking the question, why? Why are we providing ODA to countries which have GDP way above Korea. Okay, why are we subsidizing them? And that's a big issue for Korean diplomacy, because that's been the basis of Korean diplomacy. That's why the Lee administration in ODA is now unblocking that separation between foreign aid and investment, and now reclassifying Samsung investment as a form of not official foreign aid, but as a form of aid, because it realizes if it keeps these two things very separate, foreign aid and investment, Korea is at a disadvantage because other countries are now trading and competing. And of course, the other final point here is that if these global South countries create their own regional organizations, like many parts of Africa, and East Africa and South and West Africa, and ASEAN, and maybe South Asian countries, now India and Bangladesh, begin to create their own regional blocks and so on, Korea will feel very, very left out, because Korea is in no regional bloc or doesn't have really any that kind of link apart from the G7 countries, apart from Europe. So Korea could find itself very isolated in its own region. And I think within the Lee administration, there's an awareness of that. And it's almost an argument, we need to get back to Asia. We need to move away from all this, back to Asia.
May I request you to be brief in your answers also?
So sorry, yeah, just sure, yeah. But that would be my response. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Maya.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. Just a point of information, and then I'll ask you my main question. But when you said European Union nations withdrawing from international organizations, which nations were you referring to? Or is that something, of course, with the rising populism that could be foreseeable? That's more like a future scenario, or?
I think that's the trend. I mean, again, it's quite early days on that, but there is a trend. I think what's quite striking in the European Union context is that many countries in the former Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc, are looking or questioning the future of the European Union itself. Now, admittedly, that can be exaggerated. Absolutely.
Just because I have not seen any European countries withdrawing from international organizations. I mean, of course, the ODA kind of crisis and the populism and the national wanting resources to stay at home.
That's the point.
But that's mostly with bilateral ODA, and yes, of course, some in terms of funding of some. But there's not been an exodus at all from like the UN or international organizations, and I don't see that on the horizon credibly. Okay. But anyways, but that's to be. We'll see. Okay.
That's the point I was making.
Great, thanks. So my question is a couple of questions. Firstly, I'm an international lawyer. I'm more of a practitioner. I do academic work and scholarship as well, but mostly practice. And hail from Canada, neighbor to the north of our friends in the US. When IR scholars talk about the rules-based order under sort of US hegemony or unipolar kind of conditions, in what way is that substantiated? Because of course the US hasn't been at all a consistent upholder of international law, so that just always it always sort of rubs me the wrong way when I hear the discourse now about the US is I mean, of course, viscerally sort of attacking international institutions in various respects, etc. So that means that the key proponent of the rules-based order, whereas of course throughout the last decades, of course the US was instrumental in setting up the UN as it now is, the UN Charter, but has not been a stable sort of proponent of a rules-based order. So anyways, just like in terms of IR scholars, how you all talk about that, or is it something kind of glossed over and assumed? And then my second question, which is kind of related, is indeed about, because I see huge opportunities now for like the international community as a community of states to actually work together to guarantee a rules-based order and international law. And I just don't see enough sort of thought leadership and of course diplomatic and other leadership in that respect. I mean, Carney's speech, of course, was notable, but he kind of waffled at the end, and Stubbs like values-based realism, and like kind of eliciting indeed that hypocrisy of the US for many decades, but then not talking about, well, what could we, the majority, as you were mentioning, the General Assembly indeed has a lot of power. Most states in the world actually do rely on international law and kind of recognize how valuable it is to them. And just to also mention, like the Global South perspective on international law potentially, the Quincy Institute in the US did a study on sort of how to update the international order with a Global South focus orientation. And Trita Parsi said, I gave a presentation on like enhancing international rule of law and like a package proposal I have. And he's like, this is exactly what we need. This is what came out of all of our discussions with Global South policymakers and thinkers, is like just like a proper rules-based order that is genuinely fair, impartial, and applied even in an even-handed way. So yeah, I just find it interesting because, like you're saying, like, okay, if Korea becomes more of a, builds up its power, hard power in various respects, who is it balancing, or like what, where are we headed? And yeah, anyways, in IR, it's like our international institutions are also so mature despite the US vandals. And I think it's no coincidence that the US leadership now is like dramatically incompetent, dramatically, uneducated, unprofessional, corrupt, deeply corrupt, sloppy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, impulsive, irrational in various policies, self-destructive. That's not a coincidence given these international policies. So yeah, anyways, I just find that very interesting, and I would love to see also more efforts about how to help support China in various ways, to also play a role in a properly rules-based international order. And the US will have to come back around at some point. But anyways, those are sort of a few of my questions, comments.
Thank you. I mean, on that first point you raised, there's always that within IR especially, has always been, I think, again, over the years, that assumption going back to the origins of the international rules-based order. Firstly, there's actually no specific definition of what is meant by liberal and what is meant by rules-based, and they're put together. So that's the first issue. And you're absolutely correct. This whole point about US hypocrisy, about the idea that it talks about rules-based orders, but it's constantly throughout, 50 or 60 years, there's always been the big issues about the US and the United Nations, the War Crimes Tribunal, all that kind of stuff, not signing up to climate change, Kyoto. So there's always been that sense of the US talks that language, but in practical terms, there's various issues. So there is that hypocrisy question, but I think what many IR scholars, and I kind of agree with a little bit, is that the context of that has now changed. So before, the US is hypocritical, but you always had a sense that no matter what the US does, there's always that kind of, those institutions are still there, whether they're young institutions or maturing institutions. But the sense now, the uncertainty that maybe that's not quite the case anymore, that maybe what we're seeing the Trump administration is a manifestation, a symptom of some kind of wider collective uncertainty within the West in particular, both of its own institutions domestically, but also the rise of emerging powers, the rise of the BRICS, that sense of uncertainty. So, that's been one of the issues, certainly in terms of domestic. So maybe I exaggerated the kind of the breakup of the European Union a little bit too much, but coming from Britain, which left the EU 10 years ago now, 10th anniversary, it is possible. States can do that. Although it's interesting that many anti-EU governments are still there. So that's not. I think there's a reasonable point there. But that sense of creating a new international rules-based order in terms of the Global South, and as I mentioned, the UN General Assembly and kind of Korea's role in that, I think, again, in my view, the wider context has changed. We've never seen this sense of uncertainty that international institutions just do not work anymore, that there's deadlock, that there's gridlock, and that was a massive literature within global governance about 5 or 10 years ago. It can't get jobs done. It can't get the US on side, and then of course the role of China as well. So I think what we're certainly from the United Nations context, the way that China has been very, very quiet on certain issues. It's a kind of wait and see to what happens to the Trump administration. And I think what I said earlier is that the administration is not necessarily representing US foreign policy in the longer term. So maybe once this moment is over, there's a kind of going back to basics and a kind of redrafting or rethinking what we mean by the G7. And Carney's discussion at G7 and Korea was involved there as well. NATO is a big issue at the moment, certainly for, I would say, for Canada, the definition of Euro-Atlantic, all that kind of question. So that question of reforming global governance is opening up, I think, a lot of skepticism of global governance. I think the concern is that domestic populism, I mean, again, from a European perspective, it's quite striking how the language used now would be completely illegitimate, not even discussed 5 or 10 years ago. That's the kind of language, kind of legitimacy that these movements are having. Now, that may be exaggerated, and I understand, I take your point, but I think there's a trend emerging here, and we can no longer guarantee that rules-based order in terms of the international organizations can necessarily survive that. I mean, I know I'm quite a little bit skeptical about these institutions now. I think there's definitely something occurring which hasn't happened before.
Yeah, anyways, that would require further probing, because we're still at peak international law, and I've been worked with and in plenty of international institutions without the US, for example. And China is still very vigorously showing up, and of course these are treaties, international organizations are created for very practical problems to collaborate and solve. So even if there's of course the backlash and the sort of cultural zeitgeist of nationalism, popular, which is of course it's very, very obvious. The kind of emotional populism, but at the end of the day, like nations and the international will have to keep solving problems that need multilateral solutions. And the US and China, if you would kind of measure or like quantify the number of international organizations they're involved in now, even with the US, temper tantrums in various, according to various institutions, it's still probably the greatest number in history, greatest number of engagements. So yes, I mean that's certainly a cultural kind of impulsive thing.
Thank you. Please, like the next question, so that we can have more discussion.
I understand.
Yeah. But
these are actually bilateral. Then it's going to be like others are not.
Yeah. I was just finishing up a few more thoughts, and you can move on now, Sandeep.
Please. Can I just say a comment in response to that? So this is why I think that the domestic side to it hasn't had so much empowerment. We have the technology, the social media. It hasn't been this sense of ability to get these ideas out there. So I think a lot of this about the domestic politics, about which political parties are going to gain power, and often their electoral success is based on being anti-multilateralism, anti-international law, and that's rhetoric, that's electoral, but it's something that is, in my view, something very, very new. The empowerment of this is very, very new. We don't know the consequences of that, but absolutely, I take your point there about the multilateral is still very much alive and kicking on that. Absolutely, yeah.
But yes, like USA idea was destroyed very quickly, for example.
I think that's a very very, very fair point. Absolutely, I take that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So, Ms. Constantina, please.
Thanks a lot to all of you and the presentator. Thanks a lot. It was very interesting and a little bit difficult for me, the English. We are very quick and sometimes perhaps I didn't understand well. So I want to ask if Did you say that China belongs to the third world, or I didn't understand well?
Okay, so this has been a big facet of China's.
It was rhetoric, or?
Not rhetoric, because this is talked about. This has been talked about. So not reality very clearly, but of course depends on how you define third world. But in terms of the way that it's been used, China is always very careful not to see itself as or promote itself as a visible, powerful nation. That's a very difficult balance for China to make, given its power and given its role. But a lot of this has to do with its relationships with the global South. This starts in that United Nations speak, and very much part of Chinese foreign policy, the Belt and Road policies and so on. China's role in the United Nations. So in the United Nations Security Council, China sees itself as representing, and that representation question becomes a big one. Whether representation means more effectiveness is another question. But that's how China's promoted itself, as a kind of developing country, as a third world country. And that was the Chinese mindset, and even during the Cold War period, it saw the Americans and the West, the Europeans as the Soviets, as the same problem. They're all Western countries. That was the whole point of the kind of Mao Zedong's projection of China and the China-Soviet split, that China is part of the developing nations, and the Soviets and the Americans are all basically the same. So in the current context, I think part of this is Xi Jinping, part of the kind of charm offensive of China, that we are third world, we are developing because we experienced colonization from the West. We started off from where these countries are starting off from. We understand what it's like to be in a world surrounded by Western powers and colonial powers and so on. So that was the point that I was making there. And again, it's very strong in the way some of the Chinese documents. It's very clear that China still wants to be friends and be seen as the kind of the operator for the global South. And that has come across in many of China's decisions on the United Nations Security Council. And doesn't want to be seen as a colonial power, as an aggressor. A few years ago, there's a lot of literature written on China in Africa, and a lot of Western commentators, a lot of Western magazines, The Economist in particular, was talking about China as a new colonial power in Africa, that China was using British colonial infrastructure and upgrading it and so on. And that really hit China very badly, because China said, we don't want to be seen as a colonial power. We are partners. This is win-win. We are development partners. We are investment partners. So the reason that term was used, has been used, but in the context, it is more rhetorical to talk about the idea that China still is the leader, or the solidarity with the global South, which is becoming a little bit more tenuous now, but that's very much part of the rhetoric coming from China. That's the only point I was making there. Yeah.
So next, Professor Kang.
So it's a kind of anti-leadership of China as the leader of traumatized people, of colonialized people, and the leadership of US.
Yes, I mean it's very strong, but of course, as China becomes more powerful, then it has to find a different way to manage that. And a lot of China's soft power today is to look at the historical relationships. I think Xi Jinping brought out some documents a few years ago, which he'd found, which showed China's link with East Africa. Okay, so making that kind of historical connection, because in a way, China is and some of the students I teach in many Southeast Asian countries, they're afraid of China. Okay, China is no longer the great friend of the global South. China is now a regional power and a potential threat. So very, very different. So it's very difficult for China to manage this charm offensive, but at the same time, the reality back in the region. And this, again, is one of the issues of the United Nations, that China sees it, or regional countries see China as a potential threat in the region, but in the United Nations context, sees China as their voice on the Security Council. So it's a kind of very ambiguous relationship. And I think that's where the Global South issue comes in with the United Nations, that those Global South countries have great difficulties back in their own neighborhood, trade issues, disputes, and so on. But in the United Nations context, they can actually work together as a unit, as a Global South. And that can cause, as I mentioned, it kind of can cause difficulties between the context of countries in the UN as a Global South country, but also the relation between these countries in a regional context. They're a little bit more mismatched now. And that has an impact for the construction of regional institutions, the consolidation of regional institutions. So that kind of mismatch, and China at the moment, I would suggest, is trying to manage that, and it's doing that through a lot of kind of history. That we are friends because we go back centuries, not just the 20th century. It's not based on ideology; it's based on cultural links and so on. But yeah, I mean that's basically what that whole narrative is talking about China's visibility and selling itself as a hero of the global South. We are your voice in the United Nations. You're your voice in the region. But it's emerging now because of China's rise. And the other paradox for other countries become more, as they become more developed and the populations become more aware of the politics and again can be underestimated, but it's important that social media connection, the information flows that are going on, which impact on the domestic politics. People are more aware of what China's doing, of what China's position is, and that can feed into government responses as well. So again, that connection, I think, is becoming much stronger now, much more awareness. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but I think the social media thing, it can be very much underestimated in how worldviews are changing. So again, we don't know, but I think that's part of this, which is why China and many countries now focus on cybersecurity, not allowing people access to certain social media accounts, the bot question. That's a big part of the political game now, which I think can be underestimated.
Professor Kang?
Okay, thank you.
May I add something or no?
Okay.
May I add something?
Yeah, please.
Japan and Korea, as you imagined that, because it's a little bit imaginative, what it represents to you, Japan and Korea, because you said ideally, in an idealistic way, in a dreamy way, they had to come together. In which sense? In this balance of power. And where is India for our friends?
Exactly, that is the word. So this has always been one of the realist perspectives here, since the rise of China, really, and since Obama's pivot to Asia, but the sense that Japan and Korea can no longer necessarily rely on the United States. And the United States would like Japan and Korea to offer more to the whole relationship with the United States. And the best way they can do that, so when Al Gore and the Clinton administration, they were all suggesting that the Cold War was over, that maybe Japan and Korea can work together a little bit better now the Cold War's over. There's no longer a threat from Russia. But the problem was the domestic politics in Japan and Korea never matched that. There's always pressure in Korea, certainly amongst the progressives, that don't do deals with Japan. We have to compete with Japan. That's why Korea is involved in the G7, because Japan is involved in the G7. Korea doesn't like being seen as a plus nation G7. It wants to be a part of a new G8. So all that kind of politics behind that. But that's been the realist position, absolutely. The balance of power within the region requires Japan and Korea to come together. And not just as a balance to the rise of China, of the US, but also as a kind of as a hedging. They can work together, and by doing that, they can protect themselves against any US abandonment, but also protect themselves against the rise in China. So that's basically the strategic argument there. But always in Korean politics, any president or anyone running for office who says we want a closer military alliance with Japan will not win that election. Guaranteed, won't happen. So this is the problem. It doesn't match with the domestic politics within Korea.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, my turn.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation, Professor Watson. I'd like to raise just a simple question about the two Koreas situation, future situation in connection with what the Trump administration, the foreign policy. Okay. You mentioned, I remember you mentioned the like a change of the constitution in North Korea. Okay. I already presented in my previous the forum in 1948 when the two the government were established in southern part and northern part. South Korea on the August 15th, and our government, new government was established, and it's called the Republic of Korea in the southern part. And northern part, September 9th, the People's Republic of
Democratic
Korea.
People's Republic of Korea.
Democratic, right, Democratic, DPRK. At that time, they designate the Seoul as their the capital, right? At the capital, and they insisted the legitimacy of their own government. Okay, denied. That's why the Korean War broke out. Okay, like of course the North Korea, the invaded South Korea. Through among American presidents, Trump is, I think, is the first the president who convened. I mean, he, had the summit meeting. Okay, even the three, like between South, North leaders, and even himself, and in his first term, and now in the second term. What do you think? What do you predict the future, the two Koreas relations? There will be breakthrough. I mean, since the president Lee Jae-myung, he took the power, and the president Donald Trump, he took the second term, right? So. Would you tell me, because as a Korean, even I myself is very curious about our future trend, okay, of the Korean Peninsula.
So that question you raised there about the constitution. So one of the big issues that South Korea has always had is that it has territorial claims over the Northern Territory. So Pyongyang is essentially a South Korean or Republic of Korea state. So it's kind of inverted. So this constitutional claim in the first articles of the Korean Constitution from 1948, revised in 1987. So one of the arguments here is that if North Korea is going to go down this path of taking unification out, now it doesn't mean that North Korea is not a threat, but by taking unification out, North Korea is basically saying we don't have any of these. Well, this unification policy base becomes irrelevant, and we are two separate states. The problem with South Korea, Republic of Korea now, is it still has those constitutional claims over North Korea. And North Korea has always viewed South Korea's claims as an aggressor, as a colonial power against North Korea. So I think what the administration, if it has time, might think about doing, and it's hinted, as I mentioned, about the armistice question. But South Korea has two problems. Firstly, its very constitution, the right at the start, claims over North Korea. So a new constitution, rewritten, drafted constitution is required. Now, there was talk about this after martial law under the Yoon administration, 2024, that we have to revisit now the Korean constitution because it's outdated. It doesn't work for what's happening now in the region. So those debates were around about early 2025 before Lee became president. But the second problem South Korea has is it never signed the armistice agreement. Okay, so it's always felt, and that's for various historical reasons at the time. So it's very possible if Trump gets in second time, if he's allowed to get in another time is all that question. But certainly, if a Trump supporter or somebody in the administration runs for president, it is possible, and North Korea has always wanted this, to get a bilateral US democratic DPRK peace treaty that excludes the Republic of Korea, because it never signed the armistice. And that question about whether the armistice needs to be signed and completed before you have a peace treaty, or whether you bypass the armistice and write a peace treaty. Now, of course, that plays into China, because China might say, we want to be part of this because we signed the armistice, but the Republic of Korea didn't. Okay, so that's a big vulnerability for South Korea. And I think even worse for South Korea is North Korea doesn't care anymore. But North Korea is just not interested. It's now focused on Russia. It's focused on China. It's possibly focused on better relations with the US. It's got nuclear weapons. And my view is that the policy for North Korea now is not so much to invade or do a Korean War Part 2. As we saw in 2018-29 in Hanoi and Singapore, a lot of those documents implied that North Korea is trying to squeeze Korea out, is trying to make South Korea irrelevant. So my view is that would be even worse for South Korea. And I think that's one of the reasons why Korea has been very active in looking at the European Union, looking at the G7, looking at the APEC, which is a big one for Korea. When Trump came to APEC, I think it was in Gyeongju a few months ago. That is Korea saying that we need to be much more visible and much more engaged because we might be excluded from this whole process. But the more that Korea becomes more visible, the more Korea is more vulnerable to domestic pressures within Korea for a nuclear weapon, for a generational shift. I think I didn't mention that in the presentation, but there is a, even among students I teach, you can see a strong shift in students who are late teens, early 20s. These are not liberal progressives. These are not even conservative. There's a lot of populist far right stuff going on now amongst usually males, early 20s, who have to do military service. And they are basically saying, what are we defending here? The Republic of Korea is not our country. The unified Korea is our country, but not unified in terms of South and North, unified going back to Joseon, unified going back to Admiral Lee. That's our Korea. That's our Chosun Korea. And I hear this sometimes in communications, university and so on, that there's and ironically using social media, using the new technology to do this, but there's very much, I've noticed the last 2 or 3 years, and this happened really since martial law, that even though Yoon went and Lee won the presidency, there was a kind of a challenge both to conservatives and progressives. But a lot of younger South Koreans refuse to label themselves even as conservative or progressive because of a generational issue. They're coming up with something different, and there's a lot of support, directly or indirectly. Kim Jong-un is a millennial. They see this speaks for autonomy, Korean autonomy. Those days of a kind of the inter-Korean relations based on just politics, they're in trouble because there's a whole lot of Koreans, and usually males, or male Koreans, not so much women, but it's very much a certain demographic. And I think, again, that's wider context, that new demographic coming through, who will be in power in 10 or 20 years' time. They will be the leaders in power. And they're very active in certain areas that will be considered very right wing, very populist a few years ago. So I think that's a big shift that's gone on within Korea. But the original point you made was, I think that's where South Korea needs to keep itself visible, because I think North Korea is trying to isolate. That's North Korea's strategy, to isolate and get a better relationship with the United States. And I think if there is a Trump administration or new administration in, I think they'll try again for another summit like they did in 2018, 2019. But this time, North Korea is much more active, Ukraine and Russia and so on. That's a very new context.
So thank you, Dr. Watson. I think we had a very engaging discussion. You made a very comprehensive presentation, and it was really learning. I think the overall picture which you presented, it was really learning from me also. One thing I would but still say, that there were several expressions which you had which were not very, I think, when I tried to verify them, it's easy. For example, you said that Armistice Treaty has never been verified, never been ratified.
No, I didn't say that. No,
yeah,
I didn't say that.
Military armistice are not supposed to be ratified.
No, I didn't say that.
Yeah,
no.
Military agreement.
I said the armistice hasn't been signed by South Korea. That's a very different question.
No. You said military armistice has not been ratified first. You said, and then you said that South Korea is not party of signing.
No, okay. I didn't say ratified.
Okay, maybe my mistakes. Yeah. Then you said that 48 Constitution Article 1, and then say which was revised in 1987. Actually, it was revised several times before.
Yeah,
but also revision happened. And what Article 1 of 1948 Constitution and Article 1 of 87 Constitution, they don't have any big difference.
No, that's the point I was making. So,
and you were probably, what we understood, that Article 1 of 1948 said that Republic of Korea government will be representative of all Korean territory, all Korean people. But that's not the case.
Okay. I didn't say that. No. Okay.
Okay. Anyway, that's okay. This may be my mistake.
I said that the territorial question. That's the issue.
I would also like to know which few countries where South Korea is providing ODA and which are having more per capita income than South Korea.
Mm.
You mentioned that South Korea now is supporting or giving ODA to some country which are having more per capita income than South Korea.
I didn't say more. I didn't say more than South Korea. I said more than they had previously. So they're growing.
Previously, that doesn't mean, because several countries, actually most of the countries, they have more than what they used to have in 50s and 60s.
Yeah, that's the point. That's what I was saying. Yeah.
So they should not give it to anyone.
Yeah, so that's the question, isn't it? That's the question about ODA, about where you justify providing ODA. Do you provide ODA to countries with high levels of GDP but high levels of poverty? Because high levels of GDP doesn't mean that you eradicate poverty. That's a very different argument. So what I said was that Korea is looking at countries where previously countries had relatively low GDP, they now have high GDP. But what Korea is saying is, even these countries with high GDP still have poverty.
My suggestion would be, the way you are making careful statement now, I found, as a fellow, you can say, traveler, that on many occasions, those were factually not correct. So my point is that all those,
I wasn't making those arguments.
For example, I can give a few other also, like Korea invites NATO. Korea never invited NATO to discuss anything. Actually, Yoon Suk Yeol was the first president who, NATO plus actually Korea has been getting invitation, but Korea never participated, only 3 times, 2022, 23, 24.
Yes.
Yoon Suk Yeol participated, and then this year, after last year avoidance, Lee Jae-myung has participated. So Korea has very reluctant to participate, saying that Korea invites NATO to. So that's slightly.
Korea, President Yoon invited representatives of NATO members to Korea before Korea became a member of the Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific 4, the IP4. That was part of Korea joining the IP4. And in 2022 Madrid summit of NATO, Korea officially joined IP4 with New Zealand, Japan, and Australia. And last year or the year before, the Yoon administration invited representatives of member states, including Mark Rutte, who came over to Seoul, and to look at the various industries and look at what Korea was doing in terms of defense. Last year, you're right that I wouldn't use the term avoidance because this is just after the election, but I think a lot of people were saying, yes, President Lee is avoiding NATO, doesn't want to get involved with NATO. That all changed this year when Korea has been very involved at the NATO summit in Ankara a couple of weeks ago. So I take your point that there's always a distinction between NATO as an organization and NATO members. But what I was saying was, in terms of the invitation, this was an invitation. And also at the time when Korea was applying or becoming a member of the United Nations Security Council. So we could perhaps just disagree on terminology and wording.
No, that's what I'm saying. For example, actually we can see the video. At one place you said that Korea is not involved with G7. You say that Korea is not a member of G7.
No, it's not.
But Korea is not involved with G7 is actually not. Anyway,
well, it's not. It's a G7 plus. It's a G7 plus, not a G7.
And then you said that. You said that.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
So anyway, let's have. I think we had a very good discussion. All of us, we frankly put forth our point, and I think it was learning for all of us. Thank you very much. Now to Professor Khan.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your participation, and moderator, Professor Mishra, and today's presenter, Professor Watson. Okay, and we learn from this presentation and learn from each other, right? Okay, and as a scholar from overseas, okay. The foreign scholar, he is doing research, particularly Korean agendas, right? And I learned from him too. Okay, and also the Professor Mishra, he is a specialist in the East Asia, including Korea. So as international relations, and so they try to check the fact. Okay, it's very good. Its time is already up, and I'd like to really Thank you for your participation, and I would like to announce, our next schedule, and I would like to present the recognition of the letter of certificate of recognition to today's presenter soon. Okay, on this screen. Uh, in Korea, some of you are here in Korea, and I see the new members are here. It's very, very warm. Okay, high summer. Okay, high summer. It means we have a long summer break. Okay, vacation, and we'll have 1 month break. Okay, here our forum. Okay, August, and we'll resume our forum next semester in September. So September 10th, we have a wonderful speaker, a guest speaker, not the pure historian, but he's an architect and a worldwide well-known architect, and he's historical artist. Okay, he's Korean ethnic. I mean, he studied in the United States, Harvard University, Yale, and he's now based in London. Okay, Iain, he's London, and he's a very famous architect, and I invited him to our forum September 10th. Okay, I will issue announcement or the notice to you. Okay, so if you are interested in his topic, you are cordially welcome. And today's presenter, okay, I would like to just briefly, just 1 minute. Okay. Normally when we are new presenter or our presenter, made a presentation, I will prepare a small token of this appreciation. Okay, I'll read it. Okay, so certificate. I'm sorry. I'll correct everything because certificate of recognition. This certificate is presented to Dr. Iain Watson, acting associate professor, Ajou University, Republic of Korea, in recognition of his outstanding contribution as the guest speaker at the 141st Global Thursday Forum for his presentation entitled A Korean International Relations Perspective on the Current Administration's Strategic Ambiguity with America First, delivered on 16 July 2026. The Global Thursday Forum is hosted by the History NGO Forum for Peace in East Asia, an international non-governmental organization based in Seoul, Republic of Korea, in collaboration with the Thursday Forum Steering Committee, composed of scholars, experts, and civil society leaders committed to promoting peace, dialogue, and international understanding. Sung-Ho Kang, Chair, Global Thursday Forum, on behalf of the History NGO Forum for Peace in East Asia and the Thursday Forum Steering Committee. Okay, thank you very much. We'll present it, send it to you by email, okay? To
Thank you very
Professor
much.
Iain Watson.
I'll be back in Korea in September for the new term, so maybe see you in the new
Yeah.
term. Yeah, great.
We'll resume September 10th and have a wonderful summer vacation break. Okay, and see you again. Okay, everybody enjoy your
great. Thank you. Yeah.
summer break and hope to see you. Okay, and Professor O 달령 okay, 영달 okay, 충남 National University joined Judith and Rebecca. Okay, and all members. Thank you, and should say bye. Okay. Bye, everybody. Take good care. Okay. Bye-bye.